One of the first things you'll notice with regards to this weekend's gospel is that it follows immediately on the heels of last weekend's gospel. Both stories, of course, taken from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16. So, as sort of a quick recap, you might recall how last weekend Peter was named the first pope, the first leader of the fledgling church. But then this weekend, we hear Jesus speaking about his suffering and death for the first time, which obviously provokes something in St. Peter. So, what we hear is that Peter takes Jesus aside and rebukes him. And particularly what we hear is that Peter says to Jesus, "God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you." Now, in the face of it, it might seem like that Peter is simply trying to be a good friend, trying to protect the Lord from a certain pessimism and negativity, especially in light of the fact that, again, the church has just been founded in a certain sense, and Peter has just been named the first pope. But if we pay attention to issues of language and context, perhaps we might realize that something else is going on here. So I just want to walk you through these details one piece at a time. So the first thing I kind of want you to notice right off the bat is that even though the lectionary says this weekend that Peter simply takes Jesus aside, thereby implying sort of a gentle, friendly conversation, in the original Greek what we hear actually is that Peter takes possession of the Lord, or perhaps more accurately, takes the Lord to himself, which implies a much more aggressive and even violent stance. Because you got to remember that even though St. Peter is the first pope, he's not a slight, frail old man. Instead, he's sort of a rough and tumble sort of guy, a blue-collar fisherman, someone with the strength and the stamina to fish all night. He's the guy who cuts off the servant's ear in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? Pope Francis wouldn't do that, right? So that's the image you want to keep in mind. So again, here's this kind of burly guy, this strong man who isn't simply taking the Lord aside for a friendly conversation. He is the one who very violently pulls the Lord aside to give him a piece of his mind. Second thing I want you to notice, and this is kind of related to the first point. When we look elsewhere in the Gospel of Matthew for where else Jesus is roughly taken aside for a private conversation, we find the same idea in the temptation of Jesus in the desert, which we find, of course, in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 4. So you think back to that earlier story. So here's the devil forcefully taking the Lord to himself, taking possession of the Lord again, forcefully removing him from this quiet place of contemplation in the desert and bringing him to the city of Jerusalem, specifically to the top of the Jerusalem temple, and tempting him, "Throw yourself off and let the angels catch you below." Now, the common denominator between this earlier story and this weekend's gospel is here you have this kind of peculiar and even kind of awkward situation where the creature is trying to tell the creator God, "Look, this is what I think is a better way to run this world," even though you're supposed to be the one living a true God. Third point with regards to this opening line describing St. Peter's action vis-a-vis the Lord, you'll notice that Peter actually rebukes the Lord, which is funny because elsewhere in the gospel, it's usually the Lord who's doing the rebuking. Specifically when the Lord is rebuking the winds and the waves, which of course represents evil and chaos and wickedness in the world, or when he's rebuking demons, as in the context of an exorcism. In any case, the underlying point is to kind of underline the great arrogance and impetuosity of St. Peter, who dares to rebuke the Lord with the same aggression and vehemence with which the Lord himself rebukes the forces of evil in the context of this world. Okay, so how does the Lord respond? Well, funny enough, he responds by calling Peter a whole bunch of names, which is not meant to be kind of petty, like the Lord is not like that, but it's meant to be specifically remedial. Everything the Lord says to Peter is very intentional and very purposeful and very deliberate. It's meant to help him become a better man and a better leader of the church. So the first thing you'll notice is that Jesus calls Peter Satan, which sounds pretty harsh, but basically it's a very technical term which means someone who opposes or someone who obstructs. So the whole idea here is that the Lord is kind of telling Peter, look, there is something about your attitude, something about the way that you're relating to me, the way that you're relating to life, which is diametrically opposed to the particular means by which I seek to bring salvation to this world. Because you got to keep in mind that Peter, even though he's aggressive, even though he's a bit of a bully at times, he is no dummy. And so what he's thinking in a certain sense is like, look, if my master says he's going to suffer and die for the salvation of the world, then probably the number two man is not too far behind. So he's kind of being selfish in motivation, right? And the Lord here again is correcting him. In a certain sense, what he's saying is, look, your fear of suffering, your fear of death, again, is diametrically opposed to the particular means by which I seek to bring salvation to the world. Because, of course, how do I seek to bring salvation to the world? It's precisely through the cross. And you of all people, the rock of the church, the first pope, you need to get this. Otherwise, your whole ministry will fall to the ground like a deck of cards. The second point is this. The Lord says to Peter, "Get behind me." And of course, the whole line actually is, "Get behind me, Satan." But he's not, again, like kind of casting Peter aside, saying, like, look, to hell with you or something like that. What he's saying to Peter is, like, this is what it looks like to be in proper relationship with the master. Like, what does it mean to be a disciple? To never go ahead of the master. To never tell the master, like, this is what you should do, this is how you should go about your life, this is where I want to go. The disciple always goes behind the master. Get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, Peter. Humility, docility, and obedience. Those three things always have to be the governing principles when it comes to being a true disciple of the Lord, especially if a person wants to be an authentic leader and witness in the context of the church and the context of this world. Third point is this, and for my money, this is kind of the most interesting part of the gospel. The Lord calls St. Peter a stumbling block, which if you think about it, is sort of a play on words. So last weekend he was called the rock of the church, right? The first pope, the first leader of the church. But now again he's being called a stumbling block, or perhaps we may even say a stumbling rock, which speaks to the fact that in a certain sense the Lord is presenting Peter with sort of a binary option, saying, I present to you one of two options in the absence of a third option. Either you walk the path of suffering love, in which case you become a really effective leader of the church, a great witness to the church, drawing people to Christ through the example of your life, or you do not. You choose to reject the path of suffering love, in which case people don't remain in a neutral position. They actually fall away from Christ because of the scandal of your witness or lack thereof. And again, the whole point is that it's simply one or the other. Either you walk the path of sacrificial love, in which case you become a tremendous witness to the church, or you choose to reject the path of suffering love, in which case people fall away from the church because of the scandal of your witness. You know, the example that comes to mind, I remember listening to this talk by this really famous American priest named Father John Riccardo, who I think mentioned before has a really great podcast called Christ is the Answer. In any case, in the context of this particular talk, Father John was sharing his experience about why he fell away from the church so many years ago, before eventually, of course, coming back. And what he said was that basically as a young man, or perhaps even as a young boy, he perceived that to be an authentic Christian, or to be an authentic disciple of the Lord, meant that you had to walk the path of suffering love. The only difficulty was that when he looked at his immediate circumstances, he couldn't perceive anyone in his immediate circle who was actually living in that way. And then the combination of both those things is ultimately what led him to fall away from the church. And you see, the thing I want to impress upon you is that I don't think that's an isolated case. And so I think a lot of people go to Mass, for example, and they see people who are nice, people who are kind, people who are polite, people who perhaps open doors for people, and yet realize, as we all do actually, that that is substantially and qualitatively different than constantly living out of the space where I deny myself, take up my cross, and follow the Lord. But you see, it speaks to the fact that even though people might not be able to quote this particular gospel chapter and verse, they know of it. And perhaps more to the point, they know what it represents. People know intuitively that to be a Christian in the most authentic sense of the term means that I need to embody in my very being the suffering and crucified Christ. And the whole point for our purposes is to realize that people are watching. Our kids are watching, our neighbors are watching, our friends are watching, our coworkers are watching. The world is watching. And what the gospel is saying to us in a certain sense is that based on what these people see in us, they will either fall away from the Christian thing, or they will give glory to their Father in heaven. And may God bless you all.